What is back? Welcome up. Today we will be continuing our Victoria 3 tutorial series, and we're going to be talking about expansion, namely how to do it as efficiently as possible. Now, this is a topic that we've discussed before, but there are a lot of changes that have been introduced in 1.7, and so we are going to be discussing how this changes the metagame. In this video, we are going to be first talking about kind of a little bit of a review of the basic principles that underlie what constitutes efficient expansion. Then we are going to be talking about the 1.7 changes, namely kind of introducing this principle of timing windows that are newly introduced due to a variety of factors, and then we will be providing some examples of some places that are going to be pretty efficient to expand into. As with any type of decision making, you want to think about what your trade-off is, what's the opportunity cost, and in this case, you're going to have a scarce resource, and that scarce resource is going to be infamy. And so for all of your conquest and expansion, you want to be as infamy as efficient as you possibly can. Now, if you're going high infamy, obviously this is no longer a scarce resource, in which case the speed at which you can declare plays, roughly every 100 to 120 days, as well as the number of maneuvers you have per play, are going to be your scarce resources, but your target prioritization is not very important when you're high infamy, and so we're not really going to focus on that. Because of your thinking of infamy as a scarce resource, you also never want to be on zero infamy, because then you are not decaying any infamy. If you're not using your infamy decay, you're effectively losing it, and you want to think of infamy beyond a sort of RP consideration. This is how, scary I am in the world, and instead think of it as a resource that you generate very, very slowly. That being said, it's important to know how exactly, plays go to cost infamy. If we take a look kind of here, we could hover, we could see that there's a base value for that certain thing. In this case, make protectorate. Conquest straight up is going to be a 5 infamy for the multiplier here, and then it's going to be multiplied by a bunch of things, a bunch of modifiers. And so let's kind of jump into the wiki, which is actually a very good resource in this regard for looking at infamy. We can see the formula here, which, as you see, the base value for us was going to be based off of protectorating, and then it's multiplied by a bunch of other things. We have pop multipliers, state multipliers, etc. Initiator plus target multiplier, subject, unrecognized target modifier, and other modifiers. Now, there are going to be 3 modifiers that we talk about in particular for our more basic explanation, the most important of which, and kind of the most important one overall, is going to be the population multiplier. Now, this does kind of have a floor value of 1 plus the pop multiplier, so this means states that only have 20k population still cost a decent chunk, but it is going to be 3 times population in millions, and then this number is going to have a cap at 5. So this means that every state over 1.66 million population is going to cost the exact same amount of infamy, which is one of the reasons all the Chinese states cost the exact amount of infamy, and there's going to be an overall cap in the case that you are targeting the entire nation of 50, and this overall cap is achieved by adding all of the states together. So this is kind of an important note to make, an important strange bit of distinction. This 50 is not reading the population, the targeted population in millions. Instead, it is adding up all the constituent states. So if you were to go and protectorate a country that had 10 million pops and 2 states, or a country that had 10 million pops and 1 state, it would cost twice as much infamy to go after the 2 state, assuming this, pops are distributed equally, it would cost twice as much infamy to go after the 2 state countries. So this is an important, strange little tidbit, but one of the reasons, or the reason that this is so importantly informs where you should expand, is because of this cap. This cap is very, very critical, because there's a lot of things that you get from expansion. You get adjacencies for trade, you get diplomatic strategic interests, you get the loud cars outside, you also get fronts by which you can push and expand into other people. Occasionally you get spots for special buildings, but generally speaking, the 2 things that you are getting most of the time when you are expanding are not stuff like the Suez Canal, but instead what you are getting is either resources or population, and you want to spend as little infamy as possible to get as much of those 2 things as possible. And what this means is that if you are going for a resource-dense state, what you want to do is you want to find a state that has low population relative to those resources. And the reason for this is I will pay a lot less for a 600 pop state than I will for a 1.67 million pop state. And so places that have a ton of resources and very little population will be very valuable. You can see we went over here after Amur and Primorye. They have a decent amount of resources, notably gold is extremely valuable, but very, very low population. So we only paid a couple infamy for these places. This is going to be really, really valuable when you are going for resources. Now, an example of a place that I don't like to go for that a lot of other people like, even though the resources look particularly good, is Benin. Benin has a good amount of iron and coal. However, Benin's population is just over that 1.67 million, and so you're going to pay just as much infamy for that as you would a place that has 10 million pops. And so if you're going for resources specifically, generally you can find better places than Benin. Benin's good because it's, unrecognized, and we'll get to that in a second, but it is not anywhere near as good as Transvaal because it's going to cost a lot more pops, even though Transvaal has other modifiers working against it, or it's going to cost a lot more infamy, rather. The second thing that you really like to go for, you do value getting more population. It's just, if you are going to go for population, you really don't want to go for, it's not very efficient to go for states that cost 1.67 million, because let's say you conquer 5 states that cost 10, or that have 2 million pops each. You will pay 5 times as much infamy than if you were to take one state with 10 million pops. And so it's much more efficient to, if you are over or approaching the cap of 1.67 million, it is much, much more efficient to go after states like Punjab, which have enormous populations, because that will be much more infamy efficient, because the conquering Punjab will cost you just as much authority, all other things equal, or just as much infamy, rather, as conquering Benin, because they are both over 1.67 million. So generally you're going to go for these resource really heavy states like Transvaal and Orania, or Freistaat rather, or you're going to go for like states in China, which are going to have enormous populations, and southern Anhui, again, is going to cost, in terms of the pop modifier, just as much infamy as going after Benin, because both are over 1.67 million. The next modifier that's important to cover is the initiator and target modifiers, which are based on the rank and recognition status. You can see a table for it over here. The TLDR is the bigger you are, the more infamy you will pay for targets, and the less recognized you are, the more infamy you will pay for targets. So you can see here, if you are an unrecognized major power, you pay plus 50%. This is the most you can pay. And if you are recognized and small, that is if you are an insignificant power, you will be getting minus 10%. There's a further modifier, it stacks additively with whatever your target is, and that is going to be bigger the more recognized they are, and also it is going to be bigger the bigger they are, and so the cheapest ones are going to be unrecognized powers in their entirety, where you will get a minus 50% discount. It is perhaps worth noting that this equation is actually not correct, because the state multiplier does not stack multiplicatively with initiator and target modifiers. I don't know if this is working as designed or if this is a bugged, but it stacks additively, which means if you are an unrecognized, or if you're an insignificant power and you are going after an unrecognized power and they are unincorporated, then you will be able to go for targets for 0 infamy. I don't think this is working as intended. We can kind of come up with an example here where we are going after a state here from Great Qing is Kokand, where if you look at these and you do the math for it, what the value should be here, the cost should be not 1.7, but 1.4. But because this is stacking additively, the homeland, incorporated state, unrecognized regional power, and unrecognized major power, because it's all stacking additively, and the regional and major power modifiers would be slightly over 1, this makes it so it will cost slightly more infamy than it otherwise would. It should cost 1.4. If the penalties or the modifiers for homeland and unincorporated state were stacking multiplicatively with each other, which they're not, the value would instead be 2.1. You can do the math on this, but it is in fact not working as designed. But this doesn't come very often, because it's not often the case that you are targeting something that's a homeland for you or targeting something that's unincorporated. So we don't need to worry about the fact that it's not stacking properly too much, and the fact that you're getting more of these modifiers will still always reduce the amount of infamy that you are generating. So the final kind of thing thing we want to talk about for the basics is the subject multiplier. It will cost less infamy to subjugate someone and then annex them, and the reason for this is the base multiplier cost for subjugation is 2. The base multiplier for annexation is 5. And so what you will do is you will subjugate someone, you will pay the 2 infamy. Then, once they are a subject, you will only pay a quarter for the rest of the subsequent actions you take against them. If you are playing the full price, to reduce autonomy on them, you will pay the 2 again, but you will multiply it by 0.25, making you pay 0.5. So now you are up to 2.5, and you have a dominion in terms of your base multiplier. If you reduce them to puppet, it will cost 2 base, but multiplied by 0.25 is another 0.5. So you will be up to 3 base infamy. And then finally, if you go to annex someone once they are already your subject, it will be that 5 base price multiplied by 0.25 is 1.25 added to the 3 we've previously accumulated, and that's 4.25. For a base cost, if you are annexing a subject and paying the full infamy to reduce autonomy on them each time, you will have a base cost of 4.5, or 4.25 rather, or 85% of the amount of infamy it would otherwise cost. And so going after someone, if you don't need their territory immediately, by subjugating them first has kind of always been a little bit of a strategy. And this kind of brings us up to speed where we have been before 1.7, where we're caring about population quite a lot. We are preferring to make subjects and then eventually annex them unless the territory is very important to get quickly, as in the case of gold, and we are in particular going after countries that are unrecognized as often as possible because we will pay less infamy for them. Now, all this brings us to 1.7 and the changes for 1.7. To briefly kind of summarize the effects of 1.7 is you generally acquire a lot less infamy now than you used to. You want to annex more people than you previously did rather than subjugate. And finally, you want to go for recognized powers initially, and then you want to go for unrecognized countries after that. And also, going after characters in particular is going to be a lot more valuable than it was previously because of how modifiers stack with each other. Let's talk about subjects first. Now, there's a lot of kind of moving parts for these changes, but the first and most obvious one regarding subjects is you can now decrease autonomy on your subjects for 0 infamy instead of having to pay 0.5 base cost infamy, which means that you can now annex a subject, go from protectorate to annex. If you are going to reduce autonomy in this way, you can now do it for 65% of the total infamy cost instead of 85% of the total infamy cost, which is a huge reduction. You see, we do this here, but at the same time, you notice it's going to add liberty desire onto the other subject, and it's also a function of how low liberty desire you can get, and this will be throttling you to some extent more so than the 5-year threshold was previously. Because of this, you don't really want to subjugate countries that are really, really small anymore, even though it's going to reduce your infamy cost, because by having a bunch of subjects, you're probably actually not going to get to reduce autonomy on them, or if you are, it's going to prevent you from reducing autonomy on more important subjects. So this is one of the drivers by which you want to take less subjects, even though they are going to cost even less infamy than before, to eventually annex. A secondary reason why you are going to want to take less subjects is going to be that you have a lot more infamy to work with now, and so especially on the smaller countries, you are going to want to just straight up annex them rather than subjugate them. Now, one of the reasons why you want to go after recognized countries early, specifically to subjugate them and make your subject, is not just the eventual annexation of them down the line, but also has to do with mandate generation. In particular, from an infamy perspective, it is going to be much more efficient to go after minor power block members than anyone else in terms of subjugating them. This is the fastest way you can get someone in your block, so subjugating a whole bunch of minor powers is a really good way of kickstarting your infamy generation. And this is going to allow you to fill out all these bonuses much faster than you would subjugating either unrecognized countries or just annexing territory. The first modifier that just reduces infamy in general that is very, very powerful is going to be the minus infamy generation against unrecognized powers. Now, this is going to stack additively with itself. And what we mean by that, just to give an example, if something cost 100 infamy and we got a 25% infamy generation reduction against that, it would reduce the amount we pay by 25%. Simple, from 100 to 75. However, if we stack an additional 25% on top of that, it would not reduce what we are paying currently after the first minus 25%. It wouldn't reduce it by 25%. It would reduce it by 33% effectively, because it would bring us down from that 75 to 50. 1/3 of 75 is 25, right? So we're reducing by a third. If we were to stack a further 25 on top of that, it would reduce the amount that we were paying by 50%. And finally, if we stacked a fourth, we would reduce it by 100%, and it would cost 0 infamy. Now, we can't get stuff to cost 0 infamy in this way, but this is just to kind of emphasize how important it is that when we can stack this high, increasing sources will be very, very useful, more so than the previous sources. So the 3 sources are going to be the colonization tech, which gives minus 10%, which is, relatively marginal, not a huge deal. And then there is going to be the civilizing mission tech, which gives minus 25%. And finally, the 3rd source is going to be the power block principal colonial offices, which per level of colonial affairs, up to 5 levels, will give minus 5% for a total of minus 25% of your max level. And taken all of these 3 together, this will give minus 60%. Now, this minus 60% is absolutely massive. If you stack all of the modifiers, and I mean all of the modifiers possible, some of which we'll talk about in just a second, and you were to do something like go after China, you will get a total infamy cost reduction of about 80%. Now, if you go after China and you try and subjugate them, and assuming that you're a great power, and they are an unrecognized regional power because they have to be ticked down one, you can subjugate them for around 20 infamy, and then you can reduce autonomy on them twice, paying 0 infamy, and then you can annex them for around 13 infamy. This is an absolutely massive thing, but why this creates a timing window is you do not start the game with civilizing mission. You do not start the game with colonial offices level 3, which you might not want to keep in the whole game anyways. You just might want to go after some unrecognized powers and then swap it out. And you do not start the game on most countries, or you start the game with colonization on some countries. But what this means is that initially, because you do not have these strong modifiers yet, and you know that you will get them down the road, all of the conquest and conquering and fighting you want to do for recognized countries' land, you want to do before you get civilizing mission, and then all the unrecognized countries stuff you want to do after you get civilizing mission and or after you get colonial offices. Generally, you would kind of prefer both, and so this means that you have a timing window where you want to go after you want to go after recognized countries, and then after you pass this window and you get colonial offices 3, and or, depending on if you actually want to go colonial offices 3, but after you get civilizing mission, you kind of switch gears and you start going after the unrecognized countries. The second modifier that we received in 1.7 is going to be the minus infamy generation versus anyone, recognized or not, that you get from multilateral alliances. The plus maneuvers from diplomatic plays that was previously present in that tech has been moved over. It's on psychoanalysis now. But with this minus infamy generation, this is going to be one of the best techs in the game. Now, this stacks additively, again, with other sources of minus infamy generation. Now, as far as I know, there's only one other source of just a flat minus infamy generation, and this is from getting a character that has the cautious trait. Now, you can see here an example of probably the best character in the game, or the best character in the game, and that is Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens is cautious, and you can see here it gives a minus 20% infamy generation. So stacked with multilateral alliances, this is going to be considerably more powerful than it was before, because you will be getting minus 45% infamy generation, and this minus 20% is effectively worth more because we are stacking additively. So this is going to be extremely powerful, and all sources all sources of minus infamy reduction is effectively multiplicatively effective with sources of extra infamy decay. You can get that from the literary trait. You can also get it from floating excess influence. But these two modifiers are going to make it so that when you reach the late game, you will generally want to pursue finding someone who's cautious, especially after researching multilateral alliances. And this is also, if you can get a cautious guy early on, a considerable source of minus infamy cost, which is going to make you, alongside kind of the not wanting to have a bunch of extra subjects that we aren't going to be able to reduce autonomy on anyways, because this raises liberty desire, this is going to make it so that you want to just annex land considerably more aggressively. And when you are hitting this kind of timing window, when you are having multilateral alliances and civilizing mission and all that, and you're getting like this minus infamy 80 so percent infamy reduction, you just like annex all these guys for just small change of infamy. You just take every state and you just kind of go for it as you kind of reach the later portions of the game. Okay, so what does the strategy and or good places to expand in particular look like? I think that one of the best places to expand is in South America. In general, South America will not have a lot of population. Now, I do think subjugation is best for kind of the previously mentioned developing of mandate really, really quickly. I think this is one of the reasons it's good, but it's also incredibly infamy efficient because these places are going to have really low populations and they are going to have quite a few resources, including the fact that they will eventually get rubbered down the line, and they are going to have a ton of unused arable land, so you are going to be getting more arable land than you do relative to population, which you cannot do basically in any of the New World. All the New World states will have kind of just as much arable land or a proportionate amount of arable lands to pop, but you will be receiving quite a bit of extra arable land, so this is incredibly efficient on top of just being a very nice subjugation spot. You also get gold in a lot of these places as well when you eventually annex it. To be fair, this is an argument for just taking states, especially Antofagasta in particular, because there's quite a strong company there. I think that subjugating Bolivia now is very good. Occasionally Peru will break free from Bolivia. This happened to us in this run, and we needed to re-subjugate them, but that is okay. I do think South America is an incredibly good spot right now to go for in the very early game. I think there are some other options that are also somewhat reasonable that are recognized. Remember, we don't want to go for unrecognized countries as much. I think that Greece has a very, very good tooling company, so subjugating them early in order to get a minor power is going to be nice. In particular, it's also going to be nice to go for South America because they are going to get really expensive once they get some migration going and once they get a reasonable amount of pops. But there isn't too much pops in Greece. There's only 1 million pop, and so you will be able to go for them quite efficiently. You will have to damage your relations with Russia. This is kind of a negative thing because generally they're buddy-buddy with Russia, but there's a very good company in Greece that is maybe worth picking up. Similar reasoning for Belgium. Unfortunately, Belgium has a lot more pops, so it will not be as infamy kind of as efficient, but you can still see here for us as Great Britain, we can subjugate them for under 25 infamy, and then we can maybe do some Confederation of the Rhine business. I generally don't do this, but I think that this is maybe a reasonable shout if you are in particular going for unrecognized powers as best you can. I do think Belgium might start out as a major power, in which case you can't subjugate them, but if you keep an eye on them, they will decay down at some points in time. So this is one to keep an eye on. Another reason to expand that we didn't really talk about, or we just mentioned in kind of briefly, is declaring for getting a bunch of native interest in spots, and so going for whatever is the lowest infamy cost in the early game to try and develop your interests. Whatever is the lowest infamy cost in a region can be reasonable, so it can be reasonable even though you generally don't want to subjugate kind of smaller countries. It can be reasonable to subjugate Congo or just conquer Congo. I very often subjugate Selangor in order to get a native interest in Southeast Asia because it only costs 1 or 2 infamy. Conquering Bahrain is a classic, and you can kind of just do this on a case-by-case basis, find a place that is very cheap for what you are getting in terms of interest. So subjugating Oman with the kind of idea of never annexing them, just so that you get an interest in Persia, Oman, and also, at least for some time, in Zanj. Again, Selangor, subjugate them just with the idea that we want a native interest here. All of this can be pretty strong. Arabia in general is also going to be very good if you're extremely weak, because Arabia, we can't really show it off. Oh, we can show it off. Wait, we haven't taken Arabia out? Well, I guess we are focused on South America, but in particular, you're going to have very, very few battalions here. And so if you're really weak, this is a place you can land and go after in general in the early game before you get your navy up and going. Also going to be very useful is going to be any provinces with gold. So a very good shout is going to be Transvaal and Freistaat. These are recognized countries, and so you are going to be, it's going to be nice for the timing window consideration, but they also have gold. So annexing these outright in the early game is very strong, and on a lot of countries you are going to want to go after these. I think now what the strategy is maybe to take Zulu and then to wait for gold to appear, and then once it appears in an amount maybe above 4 gold fields, then you kind of want to go for it. I think that going for it ASAP is maybe not as strong as I have previously. I think you can kind of wait for the gold to appear and instead try and work on your mandate kind of in the early game. And then also something that's worth mentioning is Sovereign Empire. If this is your power block, or it is going to be your power block, making long-term plans for some of the bigger countries to get the subjugate power block member thing off is something that is reasonable. So we could maybe look to do this on Brazil, eventually decay Brazil down to minor power, or Spain or something like this, and look to play nice with some of the bigger major powers that are likely to decay down to minor power over the course of the game. Also, another thing that we went for in the early game here is Great Britain. I think is going to be really good on anyone who you can manage to do it with, but we went for Beijing. Even though this is kind of violating the timing window principle because China is unrecognized, I think that the power of the Forbidden City is just a little bit too much, getting the flat authority and legitimacy from including the head of state and government. To be fair, we're having a little bit of a hard time employing. I think that's mainly because they're competing with spots with the university, and that's just kind of frictional. But I think this bonus is too good. But even like outside this bonus being too good, Beijing is incredibly efficient for the infamy. You pay like 20 infamy, you get okay decent resources. There's an extremely strong company here, and you also get like 15 million pops, which depending on what land system you have, may or may not be able to migrate as peasants, but you can make them unemployed easily by just building a couple arable land things, and then you can get them rolling out. But we also took these two states, the Primorier and Amur. These states start out unincorporated, and they start out with really, really low population, like 100,000, 50,000, this type of thing. And so you can take these for 2 infamy apiece, and they are some of the highest gold states in the game. So I think if you're going to rumble with China in the very early game, that taking these 3 states in particular is going to be extremely strong and going to be very consistently powerful. Now, to be fair, we have to eventually get some migration going because we can't even employ up in the gold fields. But we will get pops there eventually. We can put down edicts to get more pops there if it were a bit of a priority, which, to be fair, it should be a bit of priority, but I think that this is a really soft and nice expansion spot, especially since the latest patch did rework the resources here, and also there's basically no pops here. So these are like freebies and free gold. Anything that is gold oriented is going to be really strong, as well as we mentioned. So Alaska, Guyana, these types of things are also decent shouts. Another state that can be worth taking off of an unrecognized power early can be Sinai. The main idea is not the resources, because you're actually not really going to be able to make use of the resources with such a small population, but is the Suez Canal, whether or not you want to construct it primarily for, the reduction in port connections eventually, or in order to get the company, which is going to give 50k tax income, which is a lot stronger on middling and smaller powers when it's a large portion of your income. In either case, reducing or getting the turmoil ticking down is going to be quite nice, both for the migration attraction as well as the construction efficiency. If you want to let the turmoil tick down before constructing it, going for the Sinai can be quite useful early on. Now, after researching Civilizing Mission, you will get minus Infamy Decay on Unrecognized powers, and I think that this is a really nice timing window when combined with Colonial Offices to go after a little bit of a cheese strategy if you are up for it, which is you can force release the EIC as any country very, very easily without actually having to fight the UK. You can do the same with the Dutch East Indies, although it's also fairly easy to fight the Netherlands, and what will happen to these two is they will implode. They will implode into two things. They will implode into states that are recognized, a state like Java, which has a decent population and would be expensive on the infamy to go for. Bengal also, for the same thing, large population would be expensive to go for, but then a whole bunch of other states that are going to be very, very, unrecognized and also relatively low populations. In the case of kind of in here in Indonesia, these states are going to be very soft and easy to go for, and also they're not going to be fully incorporated, so you will pay less infamy still on these states. You will notice here this costs us 1 infamy to go for this state, and South Sumatra has got a lot going on. South Sumatra is a decent state, and so waiting to break these apart for the timing window when you are going to have colonial offices, notably this would be even cheaper here if we had already researched properly the Civilizing Mission and upgraded our max colonial affairs by 1. This would be even cheaper than 1. It would be like 0.7 infamy or something like this for a state with 48 sulfur mines and 40 coal mines. This is incredibly powerful. Also, the same thing happens here in India, and they are also going to be having a lot of states that are unincorporated. You can see here Andhara, not incorporated, so if we were to go to conquer Andhara, this will cost us only 6 infamy, despite it being a 10 million population state. This is a 10 million population state. It is costing 6 infamy. We don't even have Civilizing Mission yet, so it'd be maybe under 5 infamy when all is said and done for an absolute banger of a state that's going to have 10 million pops and decent resources on top of it, along with some really good, arable land, things that it can build. And so this is going to be very, very powerful. I think as any country that can hit this timing window, where before 1856 they have researched Civilizing Mission, because in 1856 this will become the Raj, and you are no longer able to do this in this way. Or if they research pan-nationalism, when they become the Raj, all these subjects transfer over to the UK. So I don't think releasing them does anything at this point. And so it is going to be critical to do it before 56. But this will allow you to basically conquer all of India for like 50 infamy or something like this, 60 infamies. Maybe you don't get all of it. Maybe you just get kind of the choicest pieces yourself, and you just go for, quite a bit. But this is going to be very, very powerful when you do the turn and burn. Now, you don't have to do this. This is obviously going to be cheese if you review the other video on how to do this. But if you're not doing this, still going after Indonesia is going to be really good. Going after a state like Brunei is actually one of the best pickups in the game. I think this is the most infamy kind of efficient, or I think that Brunei's might be the best expansion spot in the game. You get decent resources. Gold also appears here. Rubber also appears here. It gives you an adjacency with a Great Qing, although to be fair, I do think going after Macau is also really good in general, going after Portugal's Macau. So going after just kind of the normal Borneo stuff without doing the release, also very solid. Southeast Asia is going to be good. Probably one of the most efficient ones is going to be Persia. They have enormous resources relative to population, and they will tend to have a lot of unused arable land as well. And so if you can get them before they start getting any sort of migration going, this is going to be quite good, especially because even after you subjugate them, they will still continue to conquer states. It might be even worth opening with this, because they will conquer a big chunk of this because of their journal entry. After 1856, the Ottoman Empire will almost always fail Tanzimat, and is maybe one you could go after for a subjugation. It will cost over 25 infamy, which is kind of a break point you generally don't want to pass, but subjugating the Ottoman Empire might be worth it. It has 20 million pops. A lot of these pops are European anyways, especially like over here in Bulgaria, and so you can make use of the European pops if you're a European yourself, and so this is going to be a decent recent shout. A ton of oil appears in kind of down here in modern day Iraq, and so this is going to be another really good place for you to expand into. Another thing is that in general, after you get this huge reduction on unrecognized powers, it's going to be very, very useful for you to release kind of countries that are unrecognized from someone else. So if we were to fight Russia, let's say, there will be a lot of power for us to release any of the countries that are particularly big and also unrecognized. Looking for kind of the big one here, the Far East, let's release them, or did we release them? Yeah, there they are. The Far East is going to be an unrecognized power, so going after them is going to cost considerably less infamy than it otherwise would. You notice they don't even have a lot of population anyways, and a lot of these states have gold in them, so and decent resources. So this is a good shout via kind of going for Russia. Similarly, you can get another one of these on Brazil as well that is going to be quite strong. Releasing the Amazonas is going to be good. If we just kind of come in here and go and release Amazonia, let's release them as independent this time, so you can really see this is going to be some of the best land here in Brazil anyways. You have a ton of rubber here, a ton of logging. You have the state that has 78 iron mines with the iron mine bonus, very insane, and it's going to cost very little infamy to go after. If we swap back onto the UK, we will be able to see that the UK, with the current bonuses we have, which keep in mind we don't even have a civilizing mission yet, we will be able to go after some of these states for very, very cheap. You can see 4.5 infamy here. It's an unrecognized power. It gets very cheap. This is without us stacking some of these modifiers, so we can get this for like under 4 infamy and just go after all these states and then get a bunch of migration later on, this type of thing. So being on the lookout for anything that's unrecognized is going to be really, really good as releasables, because you can come in and scoop this stuff up later for a very, very steep discount. And so after you hit this kind of inflection point where you are switching to recognized powers and you have gotten kind of a lot of your mandate and you've finished your civilizing mission, anytime you can fight someone or you end up fighting someone and you could do one of these releases, it's going to be very, very good for expansion. Another change that 1.7 brought us, which is of course the ownership changes, where ownership is now divorced from the actual buildings in the state. You can see we have financial districts in the home counties that are owning stuff in places like Lancashire. This is really, really powerful because this mechanic has a very, very heavy bias to putting these ownership buildings in the capital, which means as you enter the late game, it can be worth it to actually just snipe capitals, because an enormous percentage of the economic activity of an entire country, of the income, is going to be in the capital. Recall that, okay, this isn't captured in GDP, this ownership of this building. So when we look at the overview and we look at the GDP, it is actually more valuable than this GDP would lead us to believe, because the buildings are producing value in one of two ways, right? They're producing balance and they're producing wages. Both of these produce value, but all of the balance goes on over to the ownership building. You can see here the yellow arrow, it's in fact going to the home counties. So a lot of the value of all of our economy is here in the capital. If we take a look at our buildings and we see, look at our financial districts, very near a quarter of all of our financial district ownership is in fact in the home counties. And so what this means is that as you enter the late game, especially because you generally don't want to go over 25 infamy, because this will make all your Diplopacts be more expensive and will also decrease relations and make people's attitudes change negatively towards you. There's a lot of reasons to stay under 25. We haven't really gone into it because that's kind of a lot to unpack, but you will be able to, as you enter the late game, if you can find yourself, a cautious leader and you research multilateral alliances, you will be able to take these capital states off of European countries for under 25 infamy. And so I think that this is a play pattern that, okay, it's not too common that this is worth doing, but I think that peeling the home counties off of the UK in a lot of situations is actually going to be really, really hot. And so this is something to just kind of keep in mind of, that this is way more powerful an idea of something to do in 1.7. So that has been our updated expansion/infamy guide for patch 1.7. Just to summarize a little bit here, you do want to view your infamy as a resource, so you never want it to be 0, 0, because if you're not using your infamy decay, you're losing it. And one of the primary ways in which infamy scales is with population. So this means that you want to go after states in particular that have a high density of resources relative to their population. However, this population has a cap, or this scaling has a cap at 1.67 million. And so what this means is that if you do want to go for population specifically, you should target states that have extremely high population, well over the 1.67 cap, because it costs the exact same infamy to go for Punjab as it does a state like Benin, which has less than 1/5 of the population. You also in particular want to go after countries that are smaller. There will be an infamy modifier for this, and countries that are unrecognized, there will be one for this. So trying to peel states off of GPs is in general not going to be worth it for the infamy. With that said, 1.7 brought a lot of changes, namely it is no longer or you no longer have to spend infamy in order to reduce autonomy on your subjects. It doesn't cost infamy as long as their liberty desire is under 25. However, it increases liberty desire in all your other subjects, which means the previous metagame of reducing infamy costs by 15% by subjugating and then eventually annexing people is much less the case, and instead you want to subjugate in particular bigger countries to reduce infamy cost overall by 35% instead of 15%, because you don't have to pay for the reduction to Dominion and Puppet, but it will generate liberty desire, and so you can't do this for a lot of countries. You also in particular, especially in the early game, do want to subjugate a lot of recognized countries in order to generate a mandate. This is also going to be a bit of an important thing, and it's going to be valuable. Specifically, recognized countries are more valuable for mandate generation, but you also want to go after recognized countries earlier because of a new modifier that was introduced here in 1.7, which is going to be minus infamy generation against unrecognized powers. There are 3 sources of this, and this means that before you have these 3 sources, it is better if you are going to choose a time to go after recognized countries, it is going to be before you have these 3 sources. The sources are colonization for 10%, civilizing mission for 25%, and finally it is going to be off of the power block principle colonial offices, which gives 5% per level for a total max of 25%, on unrecognized powers for a max reduction of 60%. Once you hit this timing window, you can get absolutely obscene infamy cost reductions on unrecognized powers, and then you kind of shift and go for them in particular. There is also present in the technology a flat modifier, which you get under multilateral alliances. Because of how modifiers stacking multiple fat modifiers, boy, they'd be fat, pH fat, stacking multiple flat modifiers is going to have kind of increasing returns, which greatly increases the value of the already previously useful, but now ever more useful, cautious modifier, which is the other source of flat infamy generation reduction. And so if you stack all these modifiers together, you can do stuff like subjugate China for under 20 infamy. This is really powerful, and so this is all kind of, you want to keep these modifiers in mind. The more you stack of them, the better they are, and this sort of thing. As far as kind of general expansion strategy goes, early game, going for South America is really good. Also going for South Africa is really good. Then as you kind of reach the later game, you want to implode India and the East Indies, / go for Chinese states and Southeast China and Persia. These are kind of some general rule of thumb, good guidelines, places that you kind of want to expand. And other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube algorithm thing, and other than that, have a good one.